Spirit. Amen. Dear friends, today we are continuing our reading of the unseen warfare, and after we pray, we will begin. O heavenly King, comfort the Spirit of truth, who art everywhere present and fillest all things, treasury of good things and giver of life, come and dwell in us, and cleanse us of all impurity, and save our souls, O good one. I apologize. Today we are starting an hour later than our sort of customary time. Sorry, I'm putting a little bit of incense. I hope nobody gets dizzy from this movement at the very beginning. We are ready to go. Let me set the camera and we will be set. So today, as we continue our reading, we are proceeding with chapter 35. Let's see. Actually, we're making very good progress in this book and moving along rather rapidly. Soon enough, we'll have to be thinking about what to read next in our sort of YouTube theology group. If you have a book that you would like for us to read in English, please let me know. Contact me and let me know what it is, and I'll see if I have it in my library or have access to it otherwise, and we will definitely be happy to see if the book that you're interested in is something that we could read next. So chapter 35, as I said, some indications useful in the work of overcoming passions and acquiring virtue. Although I've already told you a great deal about the means to use in overcoming passions and acquiring virtue, there remains something else to be said about it. First of all, I say to you, brother, in acquiring virtue, do not follow the example of those who in the course of the 7 days of the week arrange their spiritual works in such a way that one should serve one virtue, another, and so on, without taking into consideration whether they stand in need of this or that at the actual moment. No, do not act thus, but take up arms preeminently against the passion which troubles you most, which has often conquered you and which is ready to attack you again now. Fight it with your whole strength and strive to establish yourself in the virtue opposed to that passion, using for this purpose all suitable practices and tasks. For as soon as you succeed in this, you will, by this very fact, bring to life all other virtues in yourself, and will be clothed in them as in an armor, which will then protect you from all the arrows of passions. By nature, our heart is full of good dispositions, but passions come and stifle them. These passions are not of equal strength in every man, but in one man one passion predominates, in another passion rules over the rest. As soon as you banish the chief passion, all the others grow weaker and recede by themselves. When this comes to pass, the good dispositions, freed from their yoke, acquire in you the strength natural to them, and standing at the door of your heart are always ready to serve you, whenever it is required. Now, I dare say that in this particular case, a good example would be the administration of one's home. Think of it this way. Our homes often could use some, if not repairs, perhaps maybe improvements, you might say. However, how silly it would be to be working on improvements while repairs that are urgent and necessary are being neglected. And that's exactly what the author says here. If your roof is leaking and it is damaging the ceiling and everything, It would be quite silly for you to be putting in a new carpet or sort of new flooring, especially considering that the water damage would actually not damage the ceiling only, but also would be capable of damaging the very floor that you're installing. Thus, if something like this happens, of course, it needs to be tended to first. And only once that is resolved, you could then pay attention to other things. And I think that is exactly what the author is saying in this particular example. Secondly, do not allot any definite time for the acquisition of virtues, neither days nor weeks, months nor years, saying to yourself, I shall work and then rest, and then having rested, I start the same work again. No rest is allowed here. Prepare yourself for continual labor, struggle, and effort, allowing no thought of alleviation, in imitation of St. Paul, who says of himself, I therefore so run, I follow after, if that I may apprehend, I press toward the mark. To stop for the rest on the path of virtue means not to gain new strength, but to dissipate the strength one has acquired, and to become weakened, and this is the same as turning back or as destroying what was so laboriously built. By stopping, I mean imagining that the virtue is already gained in its perfection, and so paying no attention to its deficiencies and neglecting chances of good actions. Be not like that, but be always watchful and zealous. Do not shut your eyes, do not turn away when you meet with such chances, but on the contrary, look out for them and strive toward them. Look upon them with love, all but especially those which present some difficulties to achieving what is right in them. The straining of our powers to overcome obstacles in right actions brings the habit of virtue more quickly and sends its roots deeper into the heart. Only avoid all you can those occasions which, while they offer a chance to manifest the virtue of chastity, at the same time threaten to set unclean lust on fire in you. It is better not to let this fire come near your members, lest you be scorched and burnt by it. Now, I think in this particular case, what he's saying is, it is not prudent to stop from acquiring virtue, not to have a rest that is required for your physical strength. Obviously, it would be almost silly, I would say, to say to yourself, well, then according to this, I can't even sleep. I just have to keep on acquiring virtue and working on acquiring virtue and work on more in order to acquire virtue. That would be silly. That is not what he's talking about. What he's talking about, what the author is saying here, is that if you begin to acquire virtue, then do your best to continue this acquisition even when you rest physically. So you don't stop from acquiring the virtue when you physically stop to rest. That is something that the author is saying. I think that in this case, perhaps the words of St. Paul would be the most appropriate to illustrate this point. St. Paul says, whether you eat or you abstain from food, you fast. Whether you sleep or you keep vigil, in all things glorify God by your actions. I may not be quoting St. Paul exactly and precisely, but the thought is to that extent that we should do our best, our utmost, always, even in our rest, to do things that are pleasing to God. So when our physical strength requires a time of rest, when we are physically depleted and we must sleep, or perhaps just rest during the day, that doesn't mean that we should stop acquiring the virtues that we're working on. It only means that we should change our activity in such a way so as to replenish our physical strength. Sometimes we'll have to stop and eat, sometimes we'll need to sleep, But even when we eat and sleep, we should not stop acquiring virtue. Thus, for example, in the monasteries, when the monastics eat, someone reads the lives of the saints or other writings of the saints. When work is being done, physical work is being done, prayer is also done sometimes outwardly or inwardly by the monastics, depending on the monastery and the situation. But the author here isn't saying that you should never rest. What he's saying is that you should never sort of turn aside from the intent and the desire to acquire the virtues necessary to overcome the passions that are fighting against us. Thirdly, be wise and sensible in undertaking tasks for the body, fasts, vigils, physical work, and so on. They're necessary and essential, and do not imagine you can progress in spiritual life without them. But you must be wise in knowing your measure and keeping to it. This measure is that mean between self-pandering indulgence to the flesh and its merciless chastisement, exhausting it utterly without urgent need. Find this mean by experience and an actual deed instead of by theory, and make gradual progress. And make gradual progress your rule, moving from below upwards. Seek and you shall find. As regards the inner virtues of the soul, such as love of God, renunciation of the world, belittling yourself, turning away from passions and sin, patience and meekness, not turning away from patience and meekness, but turning away from passions and sin, patience and meekness, being at peace with all men, even those who hate and persecute you, and so on. Here no definite measure is required, and their gradual progress toward perfection determines itself within you. Your business is constantly and zealously to urge yourself to every action demanded by them, and to do it always without delay or dallying. In this lies all your wisdom and strength. Thus, what the author says quite beautifully is that the undertakings of practice of virtue, physical virtue, such as prayer and fasting and other works, should be done according to the measure of our strength. So we must find the golden mean, or sometimes the Holy Fathers refer to it as the royal path, that we should not go to one extreme or the other. If we sort of go to the extreme left, you might say, and neglect all physical work, it's a bad thing, because just as the body without exercise grows feeble and perhaps overweight, so will the excessive engagement in physical work also be detrimental, and we can actually grow extremely exhausted, frustrated, and give up all labor in this direction of acquiring this physical virtue. That is why we must make sure to practice physical virtue according to the proper measure of our strength, so that we can grow gradually, step by step, and that is something that is truly important. But when it comes to internal virtues, since there's not such a thing as sort of the risk of being overly exhausted from internal, well, I suppose to some extent, yes, maybe even in thought, we can be excessive, and it can produce some undesirable and rather odd results. But when it comes to internal struggles and internal virtues, still a certain measure is necessary and most important. Fourthly, acting thus, think with all the power of your thought, wish with all the strength of your desire, and seek with your whole heart one thing only, to overcome the passion you are battling with at that particular moment, and which is attacking you now, and to reestablish in its full strength the virtue opposed to it, which is at present stifled. This one thing should be for you the whole world, all heaven and all earth, all your treasure and your final aim, in the conviction that by this alone can you worthily serve God. Whether you eat or fast, work or rest, sleep or wake, are at home or away, are occupied with prayer or with the affairs of daily life, let all of it be directed to this one aim, to overcome the passion which has arisen in you, and to reestablish the virtue it has banished. I have already spoken about overcoming your chief passion. Here I speak of the passion which has arisen at the given moment, whether it be the chief one or not. As in visible war, it is sometimes necessary to come to grips with a detachment commanded by the commander-in-chief himself, and at other times with one commanded by an ordinary officer. So it happens in spiritual warfare. The chief passion is not always there. Sometimes it sends its assistants in its place, and frequently one has to deal with them more often than with the chief passion itself. But in such cases, it is no less needful for you to gain victory. Well, to sum it up, I think basically what the author is talking about here is the necessity for being vigilant at all times and not allowing any one passion, doesn't matter whether it's great or small, to linger within us, to sort of have a comfortable time with us. And in this way, if we grow accustomed to resisting passions, we will become stronger and will have the ability to overcome them at some point. Fifthly, be an implacable enemy of all earthly comforts and sensory pleasures which are born of self-indulgence and feed it. Through this, you will be less often subject to attack, not only by carnal, but generally by all passions, for they are all rooted in self-indulgence. When self-indulgence is subdued and cut off, they lose their power, stability, and firmness, since they have no foothold. Do not give way to the thought, I will indulge in one pleasure, taste one enjoyment. Even if it is not sinful in itself, the fact remains that it was admitted only through pandering to oneself. And during this moment of self-indulgence, all passions will raise their heads and begin to wriggle like squashed worms when water is poured on them. And it is not surprising if one of them flares up with such force that struggle with it is hard and victory doubtful. So never forget the following words of the scripture. He that loveth his life, that is self-indulgent man, shall lose it. And he that hateth his life in this world, a man who does not give way to self-indulgence, that's in parentheses, shall keep it unto life eternal. Therefore, brethren, we are debtors not to the flesh, to live after the flesh. For if ye live after the flesh, ye shall die. But if ye live through the Spirit, do mortify the deeds of the body, ye shall live. Now, in this particular regard, I think it is notable to say that in a recent reading of a book on psychology, I read the author saying that in order to do away with unnecessary people-pleasing, one has to learn how to be comfortable with the uncomfortable. In other words, what the author is saying is, for example, make a habit of taking a cold shower every day and learn how to accept the feeling of discomfort in order for you to have the strength necessary to be honest and direct and sort of straightforward in your relationships with other people. So in some way, when it comes to the passion of people-pleasing, the author of a book on psychology was recommending the reader to learn to be comfortable with the uncomfortable. In other words, he was sort of accepting the truth of the gospel, where the Lord says, do not choose the wide and easy way, because it is the narrow way and a difficult way. It's the narrow gate that leads into the kingdom of heaven. The narrow way being the way of no self-indulgence, because self-indulgence definitely weakens the soul. It weakens our spirit. It weakens our resolve to serve God. And in that sense, it's definitely food for thought when we do things in life I'm once again reminded of the words of the Lord in the gospel where he says, if you love those who love you, what grace have you? What thank have you? What's so great about loving those who love you? Even sinners do that. It's easy to do that. It's easy to give money to those of whom you know you will get it back, sort of you expect its return. It's easy to compliment those who compliment you. It's easy to give thanks to those who sort of give you good things. It is not easy to be kind, to be loving, to be forgiving, to be patient with the people who try you, who persecute you, who perhaps malign you. And yet these are the very people who are our greatest spiritual benefactors, because they allow us, they give us an opportunity to obtain virtue by being good even when someone is not so good toward us. And I think that's exactly what he's talking about here, in the sense that don't be negligent about self-indulgence. The more you indulge yourself, the weaker you will be, both physically and spiritually. I remember growing up and watching a cartoon about two animals, a wolf and a hare, who decided to have a competition, an athletic competition. And so the entire month before the competition, the wolf was saving up his strength. He was lying in bed, while the hare was running around and jumping and actively preparing for the competition. And of course, needless to say, the hare won, because the hare actually trained for it. Cutting away our self-indulgences is a form of spiritual training, of spiritual exercise that allows us to grow that, if I may say so, the spiritual muscle, so to speak, the muscle of the Spirit, to grow the strength of the Spirit so that we are able to do that which is right when it's necessary. Sixthly, finally, I give you this last advice. It is very useful, or rather absolutely necessary, for you first of all to begin with a general confession with all due attention and all the required practices, examinations, and decisions, so that through this your soul should be filled with a firm conviction that you stand in the grace of God, the sole giver of all spiritual gifts, virtues, and victories. I think that doesn't really need a commentary as such. That's pretty clear as it is written. Chapter 36, on the order of acquiring virtues. A true warrior of Christ, filled with wholehearted desire to achieve the fullness of perfection, must set no limits to his efforts to gain success in all things. Yet he must moderate and direct excessive transports of his spiritual zeal by good judgment. Particularly in the beginning, such transports surge up suddenly with great vigor and carry us away with irresistible force. But later they gradually grow weaker and weaker until they die down altogether, leaving us stranded in the middle of our journey. For not only should external bodily virtues be acquired little by little, but by gradually ascending as by the rungs of a ladder, but in the acquisition of the inner virtues of the soul, one should also observe a definite order and sequence, since only then does our little become much and remain with us forever. For example, in the process of acquiring the inner virtue of patience, it is impossible at once to welcome injustice, injuries, and all other forms of unpleasantness, to seek them and to rejoice in them, although it is possible to endure them with patience when they come. For welcoming them and rejoicing in them are the highest degrees of patience, and before you reach them you should traverse the lower degrees, which are humble self-deprecation, in which consider yourself worthy of every insult, overcoming in yourself impulses of revenge, hatred of the least thought of revenge, and so on. Well, I think this addresses a very, very, very important aspect of spiritual life that I find largely neglected by many individuals who come to confession, and often enough by confessors themselves, and that is a clear understanding of where we are and where we're going and what our spiritual achievement goals should be. Therefore, if an individual undertakes spiritual struggles to acquire virtue that are too complicated and that are not appropriate to that person's state at the time, then what ends up happening is the person grows discouraged. The person fails, the person sort of rolls back and then starts again. And consider this, if the individual keeps undertaking efforts that require sort of the maturity and the strength that the person does not yet possess, it will always end up in a disaster. And when it does, it completely undermines the person's belief in God's power to make these things possible. If we ask God for things, even though they may be good spiritual things, but if we ask God for things which we're not ready to receive, consequently, He won't give them to us out of His love, because He would not want us to be damaged. It's almost like a little child asking a parent for real poison or a real weapon, which can end up killing both the child and maybe someone next to the child. The parent won't ever give it, not until the child grows up enough and is capable of handling that which is requested properly. And so, trying to acquire virtue, having the humility, having the discernment to set the proper gradual path of steps ascending upward slowly, steadily, is quite essential. If we don't do that, if we aim too high every single time, we will miss and be disappointed. And with every single miss, we will have less and less faith in the possibility of our success. Thus, true spiritual wisdom is joined at the hip, you might say, with proper humility. And the properly humble person, the person who is discerning, will set a goal that's reasonable, that is achievable. Achieve it, sort of come to own it spiritually, and then move to the next goal that is also within reach. And in this way, your smaller goals become like links of a chain that leads you to your much greater goal. So, do we need to know what our ultimate goal is? Yes, absolutely. Should we strive after it? Yes, absolutely. But should we expect to get it the day after tomorrow or a week after tomorrow? Obviously not. We have to realize that it's a long and painful process. And I always say to people, especially in confession and in counseling, I say that Christian life is not a sprint, it's a marathon. And no marathon runner gives all of his effort and all of his strength within the first 100 meters, the way the sprinter does. Because after the 100 meters, the sprinter is done. His race is finished. For the person who's running the marathon, the first 100 meters is just like the first small graduate step. And so if all of our strength is spent at the very beginning, or we sort of set an unrealistic goal for ourselves, we will be undermining our own selves, and that would be quite detrimental. I advise you, besides, do not at once undertake the practice of all virtues, or even of a number of them, but become first grounded in one, and thereupon pass to another. In this way, every habit of virtue will take root in your soul with greater ease and firmness. For when you are constantly exercising yourself in one virtue above all others, your memory will be almost entirely occupied by this alone, and your mind, thus welded to the thought of it, will acquire more quickly the skill of finding means and occasions for its practice, while your will will cleave to it with greater readiness and desire. All these things help greatly in the work of acquiring habits of virtue, which you will expect in vain if you undertake many virtues at once. Well, that's what we say in English, jack of all trades and master of none. If you undertake too many tasks all at once, well, you will not succeed in any of them, really. Or even if you reach a certain amount of success, it won't be as firmly grounded. It won't be as good as the success that you reach when you set fewer goals for yourself and you're able to focus much more on what you're trying to do. On the other hand, since the practice itself of any given virtue remains always the same, it follows from the similarity of this mode of action that it gradually becomes less and less difficult and leads more quickly to another virtue, for one virtue usually stimulates another akin to it and helps it by the fact that once it is established in the heart, it predisposes the heart to receive its like by preparing, as it were, a seat for it. This calculation of mine is true and reliable, and we know from experience that if a man exercises himself in one virtue well and wholeheartedly, he not only learns in advance by this very fact how to exercise himself in another, but as his experience in the first virtue increases, he stimulates to all other virtues and makes them grow and strengthen in himself, for they cannot be divided from one another, as all are rays issuing from the same divine light. Well, I think that too doesn't really require commentary because it's quite self-explanatory. Chapter 37. What dispositions are needed to acquire virtues in general and how to undertake training for any one of them. In order to acquire virtues, a man's soul should be great and courageous. His will not weak and indolent, but resolute and strong. He must have a sure foresight of the numerous obstacles and hard struggles and must be ready to undertake and endure them all. At the basis of such disposition should lie a strong love for each virtue and for all virtuous life, and a burning zeal for them. This constitutes the force which moves a man on the laborious path of virtue, and it should therefore be constantly kept warm, lest it be so weakened and exhausted that all movement will inevitably stop. So do not neglect to keep warm your zeal for virtue. Make your heart share in reflections about how pleasing to God virtuous life is, and how high and beautiful virtue in itself, and how necessary and beneficial it is for us. For it is the beginning and end of our true perfections, as well as of our progress in it. So each morning try with all your attention to examine and foresee all the occasions you are likely to meet with within the course of the day, which may give a chance to do one or another good action, and accompany this with a firm desire and resolve to make use of them without fail. In the evening, examine yourself as to whether your good thoughts and desires of the morning were put into practice and how they were fulfilled. On the following morning, renew the same intentions and desires with the most active zeal and desires to fulfill them exactly. This seems to me to be a description of a certain spiritual strategy, and it's very important for us to realize that strategy is something that every Christian must have an idea about, and better yet, learn to practice and possess, perhaps I should say, in order to make progress in spiritual life. This book that we're reading is called The Unseen Warfare. We are faced with the fact that we are constantly engaged in spiritual warfare with the enemy, who is trying to undermine us and do everything in order to lead us to perdition, to our demise. That kind of situation requires strategic thinking on our part. And if we are negligent, then we think somehow that we can just wing it. We can just sort of do it off the cuff. Well, then the end result of such an attitude would probably be disastrous and most disappointing. Yes, indeed, sometimes there are circumstances in life, there are situations in life when we are faced with a problem without having a ready strategy to address it. However, if for at least a good portion of our struggles, we think our strategy through before they come upon us, it will make a tremendous difference, and we will be able to move forward spiritually, to grow spiritually so much better. Because if we prepare ourselves for the temptation ahead of times, we will fare better. It will work much better than if we have to scramble, so to speak, and try to address the situation faced with it completely unprepared. That is something that is tremendously important. Try to direct all this toward exercising the particular virtue, the habit of which you have decided to acquire at present. Equally, examples of the saints, prayers, meditations on the life and passions of Christ our Lord, and all other things considered necessary and suitable to gain success in virtues and in spiritual life should be directed mainly toward the virtue on which you are working. At the same time, try also to use all the accidental happenings of the day, however varied, not only to prevent them from upsetting your training in the particular virtue you are aiming to attain at the moment, but even to strengthen and deepen your habit of it. The ultimate limit of such a habit should be to reach a state when your virtuous actions, whether external or internal, should be performed with the same ease and readiness as your former actions which opposed it, or rather with the ease with which we satisfy the natural requirements of our being. This means to make the habit of virtue, as it were, part of our nature, and I would remind you of what I said earlier, that the more obstacles, whether outer or inner, that we meet in our effort to acquire virtue, the sooner and more deeply it will take root in our soul if we strive to overcome them resolutely and without self-pity. I think, in other words, what he's saying is the harder something it is for us to obtain something, the more we're going to value it, and actually the sooner we're going to achieve it. Because sometimes when something is easily attained, we say, yeah, it's nothing. It's no big deal. I don't really need to work hard on it. I'll just get it whenever I need it. And thus we end up actually not even attaining it, even though it was quite reachable. Suitable sayings from the divine scriptures, if said aloud or merely repeated mentally, have a wonderful power for impressing in our mind the image of the virtue we seek and for arousing a longing for it in the heart. And how great is the help received from both these by a man who strives to attain virtue. So find in the scriptures appropriate texts concerning the virtue you seek and learn them by heart, so as always to have them ready at hand. Repeat them mentally as often as possible, especially when the opposite passion begins to move in you. For instance, when you work on attaining the virtue of patience, you may choose, learn by heart, and repeat the following text from the scriptures. He that is slow to wrath is of great understanding. The expectation of the poor shall not perish forever. Woe unto you that have lost patience. He that is slow to anger is better than the mighty. He that ruleth his spirit. So he that is slow to anger is better than the mighty, and he that ruleth his spirit than he that taketh a city. In your patience possess ye your souls. Let us run with patience the race that is set before us. Behold, we count them happy which endure. Blessed is the man that endureth temptation. Let patience have her perfect work. Ye have need of patience. To these you may add your own short prayers, the following of them, of some others like them. My God, when shall my heart at last be armed with patience? When shall I at last endure every affliction with an untroubled heart, that my God may rejoice over me? Oh, how welcome are the afflictions which make me more like my Jesus who has suffered for my sake. O my Jesus, grant me at least sometimes to live untroubled among 1,000 afflictions, to the glory of thy name. Blessed shall I be, if in the fire of tribulation I shall be set aflame with a desire to endure still greater sufferings. In order to make progress in virtues, such prayers should be used as the spirit of faith and piety directs, in accordance with the virtue in which you are particularly training yourself. Such short prayers should be rightly called, in the words of the prophet, ways to the altars of the Lord in the heart, which, starting from a heart filled with faith and hope, ascend to heaven and reach the ears of God. These are the pantings which the merciful Lord never fails to see. These are the cries which are always heard and understood by the most bountiful God. But one must not forget to add to them two convictions which are like a pair of wings. The first, that God rejoices when he sees us working to attain virtue, and that while filled with an ardent desire to gain perfection in them, we seek nothing but to please God. We'll stop here for today and hopefully continue next week on our regular schedule. I will announce more. I think that some of the short prayers here seem slightly odd to me. Maybe it's the matter of translation, but we all know that our mind is easily distracted when we read or hear long prayers. And even long prayers, often when you read them, can be almost broken down into verses that stand on their own. And so whether it is we quote the scripture or we sort of make up our own short prayer, but indeed using a short prayer to remind us of the virtue that we are working to acquire is a tremendous help and a great use. So may God help us and strengthen us. And I think also in some way, I would say that our attention, our focus often leads to the fact that wherever we are focused, whatever we're focused on, will be growing or will be developing. So if we are constantly thinking of a particular virtue that we need to acquire, sort of our necessity to acquire a virtue, that virtue will actually start growing, developing, and maturing with us, because that's where our focus lies. Imagine the various virtues are like the plants in the garden of our soul, and our attention is like a plant light, perhaps, maybe, that you can sort of direct and shine. And so if you focus your attention on a virtue that you're trying to accomplish, this virtue will grow. If you scatter your attention, the enemy will sort of draw it to the passions, and your passions will grow. Thus, I might say that, or you could say that our attention is like plant food. Wherever we direct our attention to whichever sort of plant in our garden, that plant gets the nourishment to grow. And so if we direct our attention to the virtues and to the necessity of acquiring them, the virtues will grow and they will develop within our souls. But if our attention is scattered, if we are careless and negligent, then of course our attention will fall on the weeds in the garden, the weeds that are the passions, and they will grow, much to our detriment. God bless all of you. Hopefully we will continue next week. That will be the first week of the Nativity Fast. I think there shouldn't be anything hindering us schedule-wise on Wednesday, so God willing, we will continue our reading then. Let us pray and say goodbye for tonight. It is truly meet to bless thee, the Theotokos, ever blessed and most blameless and mother of our God, more honorable than the cherubim, and beyond compare more glorious than the seraphim, who without corruption gave us birth to God the Word, the very Theotokos, thee do we magnify. Please pray for me, a sinner, and God willing, we will see you soon. If you have any comments or any requests, you could leave them in the commentaries to the video. You can also, if you look up my phone number on our parish website, it's the Holy Trinity Parish in Toronto. If you find my phone number, if you already have it, you can always direct questions to me directly, and I'll be happy to answer them here. God bless, and many, many, many thanks, and I should have started with that. Many thanks to all of you for your support, those who are sort of making sure that we continue with our readings. I'm profoundly grateful. God bless. Bye-bye.